Kia ora and welcome to week 6 of fiction writing. We're going to get back to some reading of short stories this week. But of course, as you read, I hope you continue to write. And so I asked some of the tutors from the distance section of this course, your tutors, to give me some suggestions for what to talk about in this video. So I thought, well, we'll try to make it relevant. So 2 suggestions they had were scenes. I talk about what a scene is, and I talk about dialogue a little bit. So I'll devote this video to scenes and dialogue. So first of all, what is a scene? Which is a very good question. And I guess I would define a scene as a small narrative movement within a larger narrative movement. So on the very simplest level, a scene has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So someone steps out their front door thinking about some things. They continue thinking as they walk down the steps. They come to a preliminary conclusion at the bottom of the steps. That could be the end of the scene right there. There's a small amount of physical movement. There's some movement of consciousness. So there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. Of course, a scene can be much more dramatic than that. A scene can be, maybe you can hear in the background, I don't know if it's going to come out in the video, there's a racetrack nearby. So I think that's what's inspired this. A scene might be a car chase, right? People get in the car. They do lots of jumps over bridges, plow through fences, do amazing twirls and triple jumps in the air, and they crash and they run away from the scene, and the cops never catch them. And that's also a scene, much more action-packed scene, but again, it's a scene with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So a scene implies that not everything has been resolved. We still don't know, in the car chase scene I've just made up, for instance, we still don't know whether or not they'll eventually be caught. We still don't know whether or not how bad their injuries were from the crash, because we saw them limping away from the scene, let's say. So a scene suggests that not everything is resolved. In the example of someone walking down the steps, maybe they're thinking about their mother's illness, and they've decided that they've come to a preliminary conclusion that they're going to go visit her in England. So that's the end of the scene, but it's not the end of the story. We still want to know about that visit. We still want to know about what happens next. So that's maybe a good way, a beginning on scene. Maybe we'll talk more about scene in the next video. So dialogue. I do talk about dialogue in the study guide, but essentially dialogue is students tend to say they have a problem with it. And I think maybe sometimes that's a good sign, because I do think dialogue is a little bit tricky. To my mind, the biggest problem with dialogue is that students and writers in general just tend to see it as a kind of free space where they can just no longer write good fiction, where they can just sort of write what characters really say. And the first thing I would just say is that that's not what dialogue actually is. So much of what characters would actually say needs to be cut and trimmed completely from fiction. Any kind of small talk. I'm well, how are you? I'm well, how are you? That sort of thing, I would just completely cut it unless there was a very, very good reason to keep it. For instance, your story was about small talk, maybe. So that can be trimmed. The other thing is people try to hide plot information in dialogue. Where are you going to be later today? Well, don't you remember I'm going to be at the bank because we planned that robbery? No, that's what the narrator's for. The narrator can just tell us all the factual plot information that we need to know. So don't try to hide plot information in dialogue. The other thing that often happens in dialogue is people just try to be overly realistic. They have lots of ums and ers and wannas and gonas. Yes, people do speak that way, but the purpose of fiction, generally speaking, there's always exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, is not to try to exactly mimic life and exactly mimic the way people talk, but to evoke the way people talk and to give us a sense of what that dialogue may have been like. But it's only ever a sense, it's only ever a selection. And the other thing is that final thing about dialogue is it's not a place to cheat. It's not a place where suddenly the writing can get lazy or slobby or boring. It's still story. It's still in the story, and it still has to be interesting, amazing. So that's quite hard. And so sometimes beginning students, beginning writers tend to avoid dialogue. And I actually don't think that's a bad instinct. Some of the tutors may disagree, but I actually think too much dialogue can really sink a story, and it's a fairly advanced skill, so use it sparingly. And when you do so, I don't think you'll be doing something dramatically unusual in contemporary fiction. One of the most interesting things I think about contemporary fiction is how forthrightly interior it can be, and there can be stories with very little or no dialogue whatsoever. So use it sparingly, and remember that it belongs to the story. It's part of the art of the actual story itself. So there's a little bit on scenes and dialogue. Keep reading, keep writing, and I hope you have just a wonderful first week back to the second half of the second semester. Bye-bye.